Hello, and welcome to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. I'm City Council Member Keith Powers, and I represent New York City's District 4, covering the East Side, Manhattan, and Midtown, with some of our city's greatest landmarks like Rockefeller Center, Grand Central Terminal, and the Empire State Building. I also serve as the chair of the City Council's Criminal Justice Committee. As council member, I pay close attention to the issues that impact our community and propose legislation to help improve the quality of life of New Yorkers. I'm here joined by Rachel Bloom, who's the policy director for Citizens Union. Her work focuses on New York State policy with a particular attention to access to voting and to policing. Focusing on these issues, she works with Citizen Union members as well as national partners to advance good government reform. Rachel is a proud alum of Barnard College and received her master's degree in social policy and planning from the London School of Economics. Pretty impressive. Rachel joins me today to discuss recently passed charter revision reforms and much more. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So as we discussed, this year was a big year with a number of things happening in the city related to good government reform. But before we get to those, why don't you share a little bit of information about Citizens Union, who you are, and what you're working on?
Great, thank you. So Citizens Union is a good government organization. We focus on making sure that New York City and state government is responsive to the needs of the people of New York. We push for accessibility and transparency and honesty among our government. We've been around for over 120 years and have been responsible over the years for some of New York's greatest government reforms.
Tell us about you talk about some of the greatest good government reforms, so tell us about some of the historical work that you've done to get us to where we are today in New York City.
Oh, I mean, well, we've worked on helping getting campaign finance instituted here in New York City, a model for the nation, and one that is a beacon throughout the country. We've worked on all sorts of police accountability and oversight. That's some of our more recent work. And 100 years ago, we were running candidates. And one of the biggest things that we do is we evaluate and we endorse candidates for public office in New York City and state.
That's great. And I think much of what we do here in the city is we owe a gratitude to groups like Citizen Union for sort of helping us build a system that, I know in New York City where we have a campaign finance system that so many people take advantage of. Excellent, one of the best.
One of the best.
One of the things that we saw happen this year was we had a charter revision commission, basically charter being our city's constitution, and we occasionally have a commission that recommends updates to that. And we amended the city charter for, I think, the second time in 2 years, but the first time for the first time in a while. And one of the items that was on there was ranked choice voting, which was, I think, a new item for many people, and obviously will take place starting in 2021. Can you explain to us a little bit about ranked choice voting, how it works, what it is? Obviously, people already voted on it, but now when they'll have to actually vote using it.
Yeah.
So can you tell us how it works?
Sure. So ranked choice voting is a way to make elections more representative of the communities that they support. So your district race in 2017 is a great example. Right. There were 8 people running in your nine. Yeah. There were 9 people. So if you went to vote in Council District 4, you would have been given a sheet under ranked choice voting, and you could pick 5 people to vote. And you could put your first choice, your second choice, your third and fourth and fifth. And then when the votes are tabulated, if not one person wins with 50% of the vote, then the votes would sort of stop, and they would take the votes of your 5th person if your top choice wasn't out of the race, and they would reapportion your votes so that if your first person is knocked out of the race, your second choice gets the vote. This is going to ensure that candidates are going to have to represent larger portions of the district. The way that it works now, someone can run, if you're running for a citywide office, you had to have a 40% of the vote in order to avoid a runoff. But if you're running in a crowded city council district race, you could have 17% of the vote, and you could win the race. Right. And if you win your primary, you're basically going to win your general election. So this is going to mean that people can't just win with a specific portion of their district, whether it's, the Italian part of the district, or their Haitian American part of their district, or the Stuyvesant Town part of their district. You're gonna have to work to really speak to the entire district, and we're hoping that people are going to feel like the person who wins that primary is more representative of their district and the needs of the people they represent as a whole.
And for the record, we like Stuyvesant Town having outsized amount of power, but but it does mean that you have to get 50% of the vote too.
We're going to have to get 50% of the vote, which is great.
Yeah, it's great. And so this will be going into effect starting in 2021.
It will. There's a lot of change happening in our elections the last few years, and this is one that we're going to see in 2021 when we go to the polls, first in June in the primary, and then in the general election in November.
Great. And one of the other big reforms was early voting this year, and for the first time, New Yorkers, which I think many people have been asking for a very long time, got the opportunity to go early and vote on their own, more time, not just on the Tuesday in November. But any sort of key learnings or successes from your point of view in the early voting this year?
Absolutely. So early voting was a big success. 60,000 New Yorkers in New York City turned out to vote early. And we more than doubled the vote from an off-year election from 4 years ago. So we were really happy. And I think the Board of Elections did a really good job of implementing it. But there are definitely things that we need to see change before we vote early again. The first is that people were assigned an early poll site. We would like to see people be able to vote anywhere in their borough, and eventually we'd like to see a reform at New York at the state level so that we could have citywide voting. That's a change that's going to have to happen at the state level, but most people don't necessarily work in the borough in which they live. I don't. And so it would be very easy for me to go on my lunch break to vote early, but I can't do that because I'd have to go all the way back to Brooklyn. So we're going to hope to see that, and we need to have more early poll sites. But we're going to have 3 sets of early voting in 2020, and we are going to see enormously high turnout. The first one's going to be in April when we have our presidential primary, and we are expecting a lot more than 60,000 New Yorkers to show up to the polls.
No, it's going to be this next year is going to be the first time where many people will do the early voting, since many didn't. There was a lower turnout election this year, and
Don't anticipate that in April.
Don't anticipate that in April.
Or in
or in November, or throughout next year.
Yeah.
And we had, I actually had brought this point up last week at a hearing we had, which was this idea that you still have to go to a place in your neighborhood to vote, where many people don't live, where they don't live and work in different places. You should have an opportunity to go to many different places to do early voting, not just the one in your neighborhood.
And I will say that that is how it is done in most counties in New York State. I mean, New York City is its own special entity where we have 5 counties, but everywhere else, in almost every other county in New York State, people could vote anywhere in their county, which would just make it so much easier.
Right. We just want nice things in New York City, you know. When we talk about turnout, though, in local elections, we always hear obvious concerns around whether people are coming out to vote. And early voting seems to help that because it gives you more opportunities to vote. Are there other ways that we can boost participation, particularly in local elections, but in all elections throughout the city or in the state?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no one magic bullet where you said, well, if we pass this piece of legislation, we would increase turnout by 7%. It's a collective thing, and I think New York City and state are taking the steps to get there by having early voting, by having, for instance, one primary for city and state and federal primaries instead of having to vote multiple times. But also, you need a culture of voting. You need to make sure that students are learning about civics education. You need people to understand the importance of their local government. In the field of good government, in the field of elections, people always focus on the 4-year thing. They focus on presidential elections. But for the average person, who their city council member is, who their mayor is, has a far greater impact on their day-to-day life than necessarily who their senator or who's in the White House. And I think, so part of that is for getting people to understand how local government deeply impacts their life, their everyday life. It's going to impact, if their streets are shoveled, it's going to impact how they get to work, if their trains run. And so that part of that starts just, making sure that we are really educating our students in New York about the importance of city government and how much it deeply impacts them. And that's something that we are working on at Citizens Union to really dig into.
Yeah, it's funny because we, just as you say, local elections really do have a bearing on, I don't say this just as a city council member, but they do have an impact on what happens in your neighborhood, what happens on your block, and what happens in the city that you live in.
Absolutely.
But I think the focus is always, and people have an easier way to understand what's happening at the national elections.
I know, but you think about who your district attorney is, and that's going to impact whether people are getting arrested and tried for, jumping a turnstile or smoking weed or drinking a beer on the street. And that is something that every New Yorker has a say on.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. What are big ticket items for 2020 that Citizen Union's looking at?
Oh, there's a bunch. So there are a few top line things. We're looking at automatic voter registration, which would basically make every New Yorker automatically registered to vote unless they opted out of that. We are looking to codify rights restoration so that people automatically get their rights to vote restored to them upon release from incarceration. The governor signed an executive order, but we want to see that codified into law. There's going to be a bunch of things regarding access to voting for students. We want to make it easiest for students to vote. And then there's just going to be stuff in the New York City sphere. We're looking at policing reform, and also we're looking at the State Campaign Finance Commission. I think there's going to be a lot of areas for reform with that.
The state reforms, the State Campaign Finance Commission has taken on a lot of attention, but I think there's a lot of us New Yorkers who want to see the state adopt something similar to New York City in terms of our elections. I know you share that. One of the bills that we had been talking about recently, and I had introduced, was about special elections as well, which would actually reduce the amount of elections necessary in New York City to try to reduce confusion and reduce turnout. So I'm also hopeful that we'll get something like that done this year.
As am I. I mean, the past year is a great example. We had to have 3 separate elections for the role of public advocate. And there were, I think, 17 people running in the first one. Right. And then we had to have a primary 3 or 4 months later, and then there was the general. And the more people have to go to the polls, and the more they have to go and vote for the same thing over and over, they get confused, and people don't even understand what's happening. Multiple election dates depress turnout. You decide elections with an extremely small percentage of the population. And so with your legislation, we're hoping, and now that we have ranked choice voting in place, we're hoping that the combination will allow us to elect someone in a special election with the plurality of the district. And that is really going to, simplify things and also give the person who wins that election a mandate to go forth and do their job and not just run every 3 months.
Right. I mean, we all love elections so much, but we want to make people make them matter and make people.
Imagine you had to run for office every 3 months. It'd be hard to do your job at the same time.
Absolutely would be. And so hopefully we'll get somewhere on there. And what do you see the future in terms of city government, other things that you think the average New Yorker should be thinking about in terms of how city government works, ways to make it better?
Well, I think the average New Yorker should be really aware that in 2021, our city government is going to fundamentally change. Right. The vast majority of New York City elected officials will be term limited out of office. Right. We're going to have over 35 council seats, 4 borough presidents, the mayor and the comptroller open for election. And that is going to be huge. And it's also going to be when we have the strongest, most supportive campaign finance system in the history of New York City. We're going to see hundreds, I imagine over 500 candidates running. Yeah. And it's really going to be an opportunity. And we're going to be voting using ranked choice voting to shape the city in a new and exciting way. Yeah,
well, no, it's really exciting. Anything else to share with us before we leave you? Any ways that people can be involved with the work that Citizen Union's doing?
Sure. We have a membership base. We're always looking for people to come and join us. They help shape our policy positions. They sit on our committees that interview candidates for office and help us endorse them for office. And I think, the number one thing that I would tell people is you got to show up and participate. There's so many opportunities in New York City to be involved, whether it's showing up at a hearing, showing up at a community board, showing up at your block association. And we just encourage everyone to participate in whatever way is meaningful to them.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and be right back. And thanks for Citizen Union, and thanks for all the work that you're doing here on behalf of New Yorkers. And we'll be right back right after this. Welcome back to Represent NYC. I'm City Council Member Keith Powers. I'm joined here today by Tim Tompkins from the Times Square Alliance. Tim has been the president of the Times Square Alliance since 2002. He's a board member of the NYC Bid Association and the International Downtown Association. Prior to joining the Alliance, he was the founder and director of Partnerships for Parks, which works to support New York City's neighborhood parks, and which won an Innovations in Government Award from the JFK School of Government at Harvard for its work to restore the Bronx River. He has a clear commitment to making our city a better place, and I have actually reintroduced legislation that impacts Times Square, working alongside Tim. With New Year's Eve approaching, this is a great time to connect with the president of Times Square, Tim Tompkins. Thanks for joining us here today.
Great to see you, and thanks for all the great things you do for New York City.
Of course. Everybody knows Times Square, but maybe not everybody knows exactly what Times Square Alliance is. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and what your role is in the city and with Times Square?
So we're basically a souped-up neighborhood organization. We're a not-for-profit. It was started in 1992 by a combination of the New York Times and all the theater groups to try and improve and promote Times Square. And we do everything from, tourist information to cleaning the streets to co-producing the New Year's Eve celebration. And also, if you want to do yoga, on June 21st, you can do it in Times Square. Always a lot of stuff going on.
Gotcha. I will maybe next year I'll join you for yoga, but I can't make any promises on that.
Right.
Look, Times Square, everybody knows, iconic. It is a go-to spot in New York City and throughout the world. And for people like me who grew up in the city, we've seen it go through a lot of evolution. But today, I think.
Did you buy a fake ID on 42nd Street once? I mean, that is everybody who grew up in New York.
But as we've watched it go from the Times Square of old to the Times Square that's there today under your leadership, tell us more about what are the challenges today when you talk about Times Square.
Well, I mean, probably when you were a kid, part of the problem was that you couldn't get through Times Square without getting sort of mugged, and then the problem became you can't get through Times Square because it's so crowded. Right. And so everything from the introduction of the pedestrian plazas to some of the legislation that you've worked on before and that you're introducing now is about just how you manage the incredible demands on the space. We've got between 300,000 and 400,000 people a day. That's more than many city populations walking through Times Square. And if you walk through Times Square, and the number one complaint, in fact, is sort of how crowded it is, and especially the sidewalks, even with the plazas. And so people want to do things, people want to hang out, they want to take pictures, other people want to make money, that's fine. All different kinds of informal economies have always existed in New York City, that's part of New York City. And, they happen on the streets and sidewalks with vending and other things. But it's sort of like, how do you balance out all those needs so that there's free flow for pedestrians and also that you're just sort of giving people a good experience?
Yep. And so a few years ago, this was one of these issues that you were trying to attend to and had come up with, actually my predecessor, these pedestrian zones. And so tell us about them and how are they working?
Yeah, so it's basically worked, and as with everything in government, like you do a first step and a 1.0, and it makes the situation better. There were two issues. One was that there was some really aggressive, you may remember people like Spider-Man getting in fights and some really rough behavior on the part of the costume characters and other people like the CD sellers. And so part of it was about how do you sort of manage that. It was never an issue of not having that stuff. As I like to say, Times Square is always, a little bit crazy, so quirky is fine, but creepy is not. And so, there's been the Naked Cowboy, there's been the Statue of Liberties, that was always fine, but there were some aggressive behaviors that were problematic. And then also, again, as I said, there just wasn't enough space for all of it. So we wanted to have a space that we call it kind of a civic zone or a chill zone. The sidewalks, which were like a flow zone, so you can just get by. And then a space, which were these designated zones, essentially sort of boxes. We picked the idea up from San Francisco on Fisherman's Wharf, actually, where they have buskers there. And that's where people can engage in this commercial activity. Because every one of these folks says, look, I'm just trying to earn a living. Right. That's fine. Yeah. And so that worked, but we wanted to improve it a little bit.
Sure. And I think New Yorkers appreciate the uniqueness and the weirdness of having in these big spaces like Times Square, but also want to have the ability to be safe and comfortable in their travels.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we found, because we were just monitoring social media, and then we actually did a survey in March of people, New Yorkers and others, and found that 47% of people had some kind of unpleasant interaction with the costume characters, and that 1 in 5 had actually been sort of touched without consent. And that's it's not always sexual touching, although just to read from a tweet this year, talked about Elmo had his paw on my crotch. Then it talked about Mickey, Minnie, and Captain America. It took their picture. It was cute. Then they circled us and demanded $10. They were nasty about it. Kid was confused. So the key thing is, if you're in the zone, then you have, you as a customer have control about whether you're interacting with them. What's been happening is a lot of people where they grab and touch people and then pull them over. So the bill would basically say, you're going to do this stuff. You really have to stay in the zone.
Got it. And how do you think it's going to impact the activity in Times Square in terms of maintaining flow between commercial and non-commercial?
I think it'll make a big difference in terms of just keeping the flow going, because again, you know how crowded it is in Times Square. Also, there's parts of Times Square, like right on 42nd Street, where these rules didn't apply initially, so it would apply there to clarify that, because 42nd Street gets really crowded, especially around theater time. And it'll also allow people to earn a living, but it will also, make it more clear what the rules are. And when you have ambiguity, that's when you have the unnecessary excessive enforcement. We don't need people getting arrested. Clear rules help everybody, both the cops and the people that are engaged in the behavior.
Got it. And hopefully will improve just the overall experience of people walking through Times Square and feeling like whether they're going to work or visiting New York City for the first time, have an opportunity to be able to feel safe, feel comfortable. So we have a very big moment coming up in Times Square, as many people know about it. The New Year's Eve celebrations coming up. I can't believe it's 2020 already. But as we're getting there, obviously what people see on TV is the end result of all of that activity. But tell us about all the preparations that are happening right now.
It's crazy. You think about something like the Super Bowl halftime show, right? Big show, lots of stars, lots of performers. They set that up in an empty stadium. Here, people are trying to organize that kind of show with 500,000 people, actually the busiest time of year in Times Square, all these people around. So it's really complicated. We work with the NYPD and lots of folks to make it happen. And so we're getting ready for all that. And I think people say, why do people come and stand out, in the cold? I think it's a moment of celebration, celebrating the good things in life, no matter how crazy the world is, and there's lots of craziness in the world. It's about reflection, looking back over last year and where have we been, and hope and renewal. Looking forward with a sense of like new beginnings, and that's why we have Confetti Wishes. I can tell you a little about that. Yeah. So what we have is like people. There's confetti that drops at midnight, and a few years ago we came up with this idea that you can write your wish on a piece of confetti. You can go in Times Square basically between noon and 8 o'clock, write your wish on a piece of confetti, and it will be dropped at midnight. Last year was 70,000. We'll probably get about 90,000 this year. Can also go online to Times Square NYC, or Google Confetti Wishes Times Square, and you fill it out. We'll print it out on a piece of paper, and it gets dropped at midnight. Cool. So we can read, and you can see some of them are very high end, very low end. So this one says, read more. Some of them are about self-improvement. Little picture of a book. Right. What do you got?
I got prosperity.
See, that's another word for money.
Yes.
Yes. This person wants to make better Alfredo sauce.
Oh, I'm with them. Rent to go down. Every New Yorker's wish.
That's a very Manhattan wish, especially. Yes. And then people think about bigger things. Peace among all nations. That's always a popular one.
Yes.
So kind of
heartwarming. This one is have much more sleep, which is also a New Yorker's. I can relate to that one.
Yeah. Because it is. It's a reset, like either for us or for the world or for people we love. If you want, you can fill out. Do you have a wish for?
One too?
You have a wish? Yeah. And again, you can go to Times Square and do that, or you can go online to TSQ, as in Times Square, tsq.org.
Mine is for a Yankees World Series.
Oh, okay.
I think very big.
Mine is for a little less mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I like it. So I'm expecting this to be flying in the sky of Times Square come 2020.
So we can practice here.
But beyond New Year's Eve, you guys do so much in terms of the Times Square. You talk about yoga, other events. Tell us beyond the New Year's Eve celebrations.
Part of it is, and we recognize that as Times Square has changed, and this is true of a lot of prosperous neighborhoods in New York City. Some of the original things that people loved about a place get lost because they get priced out. And so part of our question is, how do we tap the things we love about New York City? Its diversity, its cultural creativity, all the amazing talent. So one of the ways we've been doing that is through our arts program, is where we've invited people, and in some cases it's very famous artist like Hinde Wiley. We had a big sculpture, Rumors of War, which was about sort of racism in the country and specifically the Confederate statues and the controversies around that. But we also give chances to emerging artists. There's something called Midnight Moment that for 3 minutes every night in Times Square you can go see on the screens at just before midnight the digital art. So a lot of what we try and do, and we also have a variety of, we have a Strand bookstore outlet in the middle of Times Square. That we don't make any money on that. They make a little bit of money, but the whole idea is what are the things we love about New York and how do we invite those things back to Times Square? Because that's a challenge for our city as it prospers.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you are really sort of the front-facing part for the rest of the world when they come to visit New York. And you mentioned 330,000 people coming through. I mean, it's a mini city walking through Times Square, or a regular size, a medium-sized city walking through the city, New York. What are your what is, for 2020 beyond legislation, things like that? What do you hope to accomplish as the Alliance?
Well, I mean, we have to constantly work on the things that people say that they're concerned about, which again, number one issue is congestion. So just how do we make it a little easier to flow through the crazy Times Square? Number two was this issue about people getting hustled and hassled, and if your legislation passed, then that'll make a difference in letting people do their thing, but doing it in a way that works for everybody. And then this other thing of like really how do we tap into the cultural and creative energy? We also do something called design. There's Design Week, this big citywide celebration of design. We have something called the Design Pavilion, where we're also tapping the creative talent of designers, architects, graphic designers from around the city and putting it on display in Times Square. So it's really, how do we have this place reflect what we love about cities and urban life?
And as I noted earlier, Times Square has really gone through an evolution, both as you've been there and before. What do you point to as the successes of Times Square? What led us to a point where the concern is although we have still quality of life concerns, because how many people, where in the past it was many New Yorkers didn't even want to visit the area. What do you point to as the leading
I think there were a couple things. The one is, and I think it's true for the whole city, if people don't feel safe in big ways or in small ways, violent crime went down 90%. And there are elements of the old grid of Times Square and some of the freedom, particularly sexual freedom, that was important to people, but there was also a lot of exploitation. And if you're a woman walking down 42nd Street, it was like a bad scene. And so part of it is just crime and safety. And the other thing is, I think, there were Times Square almost got destroyed because people were so desperate to change it that they were going to get rid of all the signs, they're going to take down the building 1 Times Square that the ball drops from, they were going to destroy all the historic theaters. So luckily, the economy slowed down, and sometimes when you move a little more slowly, you preserve the things that are great about a place, and Times Square almost lost that stuff. It still lost some of it, but I think, more thoughtful, nuanced minds prevailed.
Got it. And we mentioned Times Square is a business improvement district, meaning it has a special place in sort of the governance of New York City, and there's all throughout neighborhoods in the city. Any particular challenges just for the larger bids in the city moving forward?
There's two things. I think the city goes through cycles. The city's leadership goes through cycles of understanding the importance of just public space, our parks, and this is where the democracy happens in New York City. So the public spaces, and so the plan put forth by the council about sort of transportation was really good in terms of thinking about a holistic view of public spaces and transportation. The other thing is like partnerships. Government does some stuff really well, but it does it even better when it partners with community groups and neighborhoods. And the bids are known as business improvement districts, but they're voices for the neighborhoods along with community boards and along like entities like this Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And I think you need someone in City Hall who understands public space and also understands how to work with the civic and public sector.
Got it. That's great. Well, thank you for that. And I know with the busy few weeks ahead with the tourist season and the times and the ball drop, so we are wishing you the best and some sanity in the new year and your New Year's Eve wish to come true. So thank you for joining us today.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you again. That brings us to the end of our time on Represent NYC. I'd like to thank both of my guests for great conversations about the city. I am City Council Member Keith Powers, and I look forward to seeing you in the neighborhood.